So recently on Project Betty, we did the wiring harness. We've upgraded our brakes to a 4-wheel disc brake kit from CJ Classics. And today we're going to start on the interior. The first thing we want to do is the gauge cluster. Now, obviously, we're not quite ready for a cluster yet because we don't even have a transmission or an engine, but we just got this killer cluster in from Classic Instruments, and we're going to show you the cluster and explain how the installation is going to go. Here at CJ's, we offer a ton of options from Classic Instruments, and they have gauges basically for your 65 up through your 70 Mustang, and lots of custom options as well. Now, we chose to go with the hot rod gauge, which in my opinion, kind of give you that vintage gauge, almost like the original Cobra gauges. I love the way they look, especially with the black bezel. Now, the kit that we sell from Classic Instruments for your 65 through 66 Mustang includes the 6 gauges in your choice of finish and style, and then you actually get the Scott Drake bezel along with it. Now, this bezel we're going with is the black camera case finish designed for a 6-gauge setup. This is also available in a billet aluminum kind of finish or a wood grain finish, whatever custom look you're going for your car. Now, why would you want to do something like this to your Mustang? Well, there's a couple reasons. One, obviously, they look a lot better than the factory gauges, but in our eyes, we're doing this for the performance upgrade. Now, we have the factory long style warning light cluster. So we basically have a speedometer, temp gauge, gas gauge, and a couple warning lights. This is going to give us 6 actual electronic gauges that'll be far more accurate than the stock setup, yet we can use a lot of the factory wiring to install them. Again, installed in the bezel too, they're going to look a lot better. It still gives that vintage look, but give us a lot more idea what's happening under the hood. So we're going to start off by actually assembling the gauges into the bezel. Now again, the gauges are made by Classic Instruments. The bezel is a Scott Drake piece that is included when you buy the kit. Now this is designed for a 2 1/16 gauge. These are 2 1/8. So when you go to install them, they're a little large. The first thing you have to do is take the bezel and just slowly open them up a little bit so the gauges fit properly. And do the same with the other 3. All right, their bezel trimmed out. Now we have all the gauges organized, and we're gonna start working from the back here. I do recommend label the gauges. We've got fuel, temp, oil, voltage. That way you know which gauge you're connecting the wires to. Now on our factory car, when we installed the factory cluster, we used the painless wiring harness designed for the 65 cluster, but we kept the 66 harness, and this is why. When you go to the 6-gauge setup like this, which we knew we were doing, you can actually use the 66 5-gauge harness to help wire up your Classic Instruments and make it a plug-and-play with your painless wiring harness. So before we put the back straps on, we're going to connect the ground here. Now this is the ground for illumination. What we're going to do is we're going to take the 4 factory plugs here that would go to the factory bulbs and use that positive and negative power to power these lights. Now what we're going to do with one of them, the closest one to each gauge on each side, we're going to tap in from the harnesses for the speedo and tach so they light up as well. Now for this one, we're going to grab the wiring harness for our tachometer. The gray wire is going to be illumination for the tach. We're going to tie that into this gauge here. We wired the other side the same way. Now we can mount the gauges. Just get them all hand tight for now, and then we'll go back and make some adjustments. Now we're going to start wiring up our actual individual gauges using, again, the painless wiring with our Classic Instruments gauges. They're labeled the same way as factory, so you have S here, which is your signal wire, which will be the colored wire, and then I, which is going to be the power wire, which will be black. And again, all these are labeled right from painless, and we labeled the back of the gauges so we know what we're connecting to. Again, snug. You don't have to crank these down too hard. And the same thing for the temp gauge. We'll connect our oil pressure. Now again, they do include sending units for these gauges from Classic. We'll be able to connect those on the engine side, once we actually have an engine, and be able to wire this straight through our painless harness. And finally, the voltage wire. Voltage only requires a signal. Since we no longer have a voltage regulator, we know the green wire is 12 volts. So we're going to use that to power our voltage gauge. Under the high beam, this will just press right in. Our left turn signal, and our right turn signal. So both the speedometer and tachometer have their own harnesses, which will have to be uniquely wired in the vehicle. Can't do that this time because we don't have the car ready to go. But at that point, basically our harness is wired up and ready to be installed. Obviously, we're not quite ready to install it yet. We couldn't resist throwing our Classic Instruments cluster in our 65 Mustang just to see what it looks like, and the look is perfect. I mean, it fits the vintage feel, but has a high-performance classic look about it, which will be perfect for this car when it's finished. So next time out, we'll do a little more work with the cluster and continue with the interior by upgrading both our seats and our seat belts.